Greetings and welcome to week 11 of our online course on the Gospel of Matthew. The passage that is the focus for this week's study is chapter 9, all 38 verses, although you may want to ponder, and you may have pondered in your inductive study, the question of whether the chapter breaks at the beginning and the end of this chapter are correctly identified in the traditional translation or the traditional editions. Some things I'd like for you to be giving attention to. First of all, the combination of chapter 8 and 9. You began with a series of miracle stories in chapter 8, and there will be some more miracle stories in chapter 9. A part of what I want you to have a sense of is the kinds of miracles that are performed over the course of the two chapters. Also a sense of where the non-miracle story stuff is, and the kind of interruption and the kind of theology that arises from the positioning and the issues that are raised by those so-called interruptions or those non-miracle comments and other brief narratives. What is it that those texts that are not miracle stories, what is it that they say to us about Matthew's understanding of how to interpret the miracle passages themselves? Do give attention to another of the relationship between Matthew's edition of these various texts and what you find in Mark and Luke. And the first story in chapter 9 is a good case study for that, to compare the length and the detail of description in Matthew compared to the other Gospels. And you will note, I think, I want you to see, that in general Matthew is shorter, which is counterintuitive because most folks think Matthew's a much longer gospel than Mark, therefore he must be have longer accounts of various miracles and things. Almost always, there are a few exceptions, but almost always when you have a parallel between Matthew and Mark of some kind of narrative event like a miracle story, the account in Matthew will be shorter. Matthew pares things down so that it's mostly the dialogue, descriptive detail, the grass being green, various things like that some of the other gospel writers include. Matthew just eliminates those kinds of things to focus in on the dialogue, on the conversation, and thus more on the identity of who Jesus is. Do note that following that healing of the paralytic, the first primary story in chapter 9, you have the call of Matthew. And it is only in Matthew's gospel that the word of the tax collector here who's called is called Matthew. He's called Levi in Mark and Luke. And that has sometimes been taken as the evidence that Matthew, the disciple of Jesus, converted tax collector, is in fact the author of this. Somehow the change of name from Levi to Matthew is his signature. I probably shouldn't say I've never been convinced by that, but I'm not particularly convinced that that's some kind of major proof that this Matthew, this Levi/Matthew, is the author of this gospel. Do note also the way that call of Matthew flows into a meal, not unusual in the gospel accounts for Jesus to eat with people. And that meal conversation flows into conversation about Jesus' purpose and ministry. And in particular, I want you to see the flow there. He said, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick." This is a response to the criticism of Jesus eating with tax collectors who are sinners. And then the quotation from, I think it's Hosea 6:6, "I desire mercy and not sacrifice, for I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners." That particular flow is an important one, and I think is an important concept there. This leads then, Matthew places next to this the question of fasting. John the Baptist's disciples fast. The Jews, various branches of them had patterns of fasting. In particular, the Pharisees had very established patterns. And the question of why Jesus' disciples didn't fast. And as you read that, you will also note Not only does this become Christological, a description of who Jesus is the reason his disciples don't fast, but also an explanation of the fact that once he has died and been raised and ascended, that the pattern of fasting will resume on the part of his followers, which certainly was the case by the time Matthew's gospel was written, as you can tell from the account of the in the Sermon on the Mount, the teaching on fasting in chapter 6, verses 16 to 18. The next text is the so-called Jairus' daughter and the woman with the issue of blood. And notice again, first of all, Jairus isn't mentioned here, but Matthew's compression, even to the point of changing the point of death for the little girl, and how it compares to the addition found in Mark. And then the final thing I want you to give attention to is the final paragraph. The harvest is great, the workers are few. And particularly verse 35, I want you to recognize, you've seen that verse before. If you don't remember where, locate it and see it as somehow a bracket around the end of chapter 4, thus the beginning of chapter 5, and through chapter 9. And so that functions in a certain sense to put chapters 4 through 9 together. That is the Sermon on the Mount and this collection of miracle stories. And as, at least in my commentary, that combination is put together with reference to the subject of authority. And do note the end of chapter 9 as a setup for the instruction on mission in chapter 10. Hope you have a great week, and that working in this text is stimulating and enriching for you. Thanks be to God.